Thanks so much, Brian. So my talk is a little bit more meta in a different sense in terms of the self-referential or self-reflective aspects of how design works. Also, I went rogue and renamed my talk from what you got, so hopefully you don't ask for your money back. So as Brian said, my name is LeeSean Huang. I started a design practice called Foossa back in 2013 with my business and romantic partner, David Colby, who you see here. And our practice has evolved over the years, starting out as a pretty straightforward communication design, branding, UX firm, to doing more work in service design. And these days we do a lot of work with facilitation and helping organizations and teams figure out how to begin or where the concepts even are in the early stage, especially across multidisciplinary teams or diverse organizations where people come from different professional backgrounds and have different ways of approaching creativity and problem solving. Speaking of problem solving. So just a quick diagram about how we think about our practice. There's kind of a trinity here. One is creating these spaces for telling possibility stories. We'll get back to this later in the presentation, but you can think about design as telling stories about what's possible. Right? So you're pitching an idea, and it's about something that doesn't exist yet in the world. So that is a story of what's possible. It's almost like an applied, practical form of science fiction. We also create participation spaces. So how do you get people who are maybe not so technologically minded or aesthetically minded to engage with how do we make these design decisions? And ultimately, this is about shifting power, whether it's in the political sense or also in terms of cultural power, individual or community agency. So you can think about that in a wider sense, which we do. Yes, please. Or am I too far? Here we go. So yes, one of the key questions of our practice is, how do you begin? How do we begin? I'm kind of in the business of collecting questions. I'm also a podcast host at AIGA, so I'm always collecting questions. And this one is actually from Lori Anderson. She was the artist in residence at ITP, the Interactive Telecommunications Program, the program where I did my master's at NYU. And as part of that, she had to do this artist talk. And so she stood up here, had these slides with these out of focus photos that she didn't tell us anything about. And then she just said, how do you begin? And then we talked about that for an hour. And I honestly don't remember any of the answers or the questions, but I remember the question, and it's a great question. It's both so deep and so kind of WTF. So as a designer, we can start with the who, right? Who are you designing for, or who are you designing with? How do you create your team first? There's the how in terms of different technical specifications or processes, and there's also the why. The purpose of why you're doing what you do. You can start with your process, whether you're using the design thinking double diamond or the hexagons, whatever your process might be. But ultimately, this is about designing how we design. So that's the meta part, right? Being reflective about how we design, maybe not being content with these off-the-shelf, tried-and-true formulas, especially if we have an unknown container and unknown content. And what I mean by that is, if you're designing for a relatively new thing like the metaverse or a new medium, you don't know what the container is. It's not just an unknown content like a new poster or a new app where you kind of know what box you're playing. So you could set your constraints. That's one way to go about it. And create a shared process or playbook, right? Moving beyond maybe the established ones like that double diamond or some of these other frameworks, and create one for your own team and with your clients. So as designers, we wear multiple hats. We're researchers, facilitators, translators across different disciplines, as well as makers, and much, much more. And so that gets me to another question. As I said, I'm a collector of questions, and then we'll get a little bit more concrete in a bit, is how do we redesign how we design? Right? Every new project is, you could go again off the shelf with this process, but ultimately we're redesigning things every time. We're redesigning how we design every time a new person comes on our team, or we have a new client, or we are designing for a new context. So I have 4 ideas, which are the words in the titles you saw. The first one is dig, and What I mean by that is that you want to go into the context and understand where it is that you're designing. I just came here from SVA where I was teaching during the day, so I would plug the program, Design for Social Innovation. It's an MFA program where I teach, and I didn't make the poster, the students did. Apparently I said this, that social design never starts with a blank canvas, and really no kind of design starts with a blank canvas, right? There's always our assumptions, our biases, all sort of lived experiences that we bring to things. And obviously we're always told as designers, like, hey, you need to do your research, right? Empathize with your users, understand your users. So I'm not gonna like beat that drum, but I just wanted to draw attention towards this understanding of maybe the cultural or historical context where we're designing, something that maybe gets talked about a little less. So also think about being like an archaeologist, right? The deeper you go, or paleontologist, whatever that might be. Sorry, I haven't taken a science class since college. So the idea is that deeper you go, right, the older things are. And so how do you uncover stuff? Geology, thank you. Thank you. I teach in the design program. So we see this stuff all the time, right? But unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, the pandemic has created all of these teachable moments. And one of them early on in the pandemic last year was that there was this shortage of Cobalt programmers. Does anybody even know what Cobalt is in this room? It's a great meetup for this. But like my parents learned this in the 80s, and I don't know if they've like taught it for decades, right? So you have this like decades old obsolete programming language that was running like all of the unemployment check software in like New Jersey and several other states. And so that's what I mean by these layers that you have to dig down, right? Even like some of the like newest, fanciest fintech kind of stuff is sitting on top of some really old infrastructure. And we see this in our built environment as well, right? As New Yorkers, like all of these steam pipes under Midtown and other parts of the city are like old infrastructure underneath all of this shiny new stuff, like all that crap you see at Hudson Yards. The other thing is that new technologies are built on mental models of the past, right? And as designers, we're always thinking about mental models. Like Apple got a lot of crap about skeuomorphism back in the day, like the Books app that looks like a bookshelf. And it's like, ooh, you know what a bookshelf looks like. And so similarly in cinema, right, these old beautiful theaters that are endangered today looked like actual physical theaters because it's like, it's a theater, right? So thinking about where these mental models are and how do we design around them. And then finally, thinking about how technologies have an evolution, sort of like Pokemon, right? And so these mobile devices that we have, there's an evolution of those, and they're like, you know, corded phones to like your like cordless phone, but also it's hard to see that. That's like one of those touchpad things from Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I grew up with. So there's actually like multiple ancestors here, like walkie-talkies, other things that feed into this. So it's both about linear as well as these kind of like feeding into the evolution of the technology. So the point of this is that there's no blank slate that we're designing from. We need to explore these histories and genealogies and keep on digging in our research. Point 2 of 4 is frame. And we use frame. I got my start, thank you, as a graphic designer, well, as a musician doing graphic design, just doing our own album covers, stickers, flag, things that you do as a musician. And so you have to think about like designing for that square, whether it's a CD size or these days the tiny little thumbnail size. And I still do that sort of thing. Oh no, the slides are, that's okay. You get the point. So I also produce podcasts now for AIGA, which is where I'm working most of the time these days. For those of you who don't know, AIGA is the oldest and largest professional association for design. The first podcast we launched was called Design Future Now, where I talk to people about the future of our discipline and industry. So I'm also thinking about the frame, right? Where, my most recent, sorry, is it right?
I'm not sure how to go back.
Okay. Maybe I'll do a hard reset here of the, there we go. Our more recent podcast, which is hosted by our executive director, Benny Johnson, called Design Adjacent, where he interviews people who are maybe adjacent to design. But just a plug for the stuff that I'm doing here to weave in some stuff here. But the idea is you think about the square or the rectangle for a lot of stuff that we design for. Sorry, I might have to ask you to do this manually. Thank you. So I got my start after ITP at NYU at this agency called Purpose. I think got some purpose people or ex-purpose people in the house today. And next slide, please. One of the projects I got to work on there was doing this brand identity for a group in Brazil called Meu Rio, which means My Rio. And they were bringing in more young people into the civic life of the city. So I got to design the identity there, do research down in Brazil. Next slide, please. This is like 10 years ago, as you can tell. And so seeing the context as well, like how this logo works in different contexts. Next, please, just to give you an idea. And then my process, also framing as a photographer. A lot of my process is doing research, taking pictures, some touristic in Rio, some of just daily life to understand that context. And all of this is choices that you make as a frame, right? As photographers like to talk about that it's not just what's in the frame, but what you choose to leave outside of the frame. So the design lesson here is we can also frame problems in a more metaphorical, linguistic way. And so this is an exercise I borrowed from some friends at IBM. We won't do it now. Just a thought exercise is imagine your favorite or ideal coffee cup. If you don't drink coffee, imagine like a teacup or whatever beverage you like to drink. You're probably thinking of things that have to do with like the material, the color, the form factor, etc. But like it's a cup. Now try reframing it in a different way, especially if you're thinking about the unknown container. Right? You're trying to innovate in a different way. Now imagine a better way to enjoy coffee at home or in the office. Now you are free from the cup. It could be a way to brew coffee, it could be a way to discover new coffee beans and roasts and grinds. So that's the point. It doesn't have to be a cup. Oops. Sorry, this is like. Alright, it doesn't have to be a cup. I blow my own punchline twice. Check out this great TED Talk by Doug Dietz. It's a TEDx talk. He is the head of design for the GE Adventure series. But basically, long story short, spoiler, they had these MRI machines and at a children's hospital where he was visiting as a designer, and they used to have to like sedate like 80 to 90% or more of the kids because it's super loud. I don't know if anybody's ever had one, but it's super loud in there. You have to stay super still. It's hard for grown-ups, but if you're a kid, it's like super traumatic. And so they have to sedate these kids, which has its own medical risks and costs and trauma attached to it. And so they reframed the problem from a pharmaceutical problem to an engagement problem. And they actually worked with folks who are experts in designing for children's museums and created this one. There's like a whole series now. This one's Under the Sea. And so when the kids go in there, they tell the kids to basically like be very quiet, be very still, and you'll see like fish jumping around here, just fish decals painted to the cylinder, and the sedation rates have gone down to like single digits, right? So that's the reframe. So get that. Reframe the problem. Third point here was play, so that's me. And then it's been a real theme in my life and work, this idea of play. Here's some grad school projects where I was playing with hardware and software and created this set of headphones, put a accelerometer at the top, and basically you could listen to music and then control the music based on how you moved your hands. It's called headbanger phones. I also did a performance project with a Wii remote. This is also like old projects, but it was a hacked Wii remote that worked as a MIDI controller basically for the music nerds out there. Mm-hmm. And then I also do like foil hat stuff, or I did before COVID. But the idea was to get people to reimagine different futures and to also make it accessible and fun for people who maybe have never been to a design workshop before. This is also just like epitomizes my relationship with Dave. And then the other part of play too is for the last 10 years or so I've practiced Capoeira, which is a Brazilian martial art disguised in dance. And we got cast in this music video by the Gregory brothers like just before COVID. And so it was Takeo Ishii. It's called Rat Attack if you want to look it up on YouTube. But basically, the whole point of the capoeira metaphor for me is that it's also about play and dialogue. So how do you do one thing in this case, like throw a kick or do an acrobatic thing, and then get some sort of reaction? And so we're doing that when we're designing experiences or facilitating a workshop as well, right? It's like how do you get a reaction out of people in playful, exploratory ways. Thank you so much. So an anecdote about this I read about this in a book written by a former student and friend of mine, Jack Roberts, which is called Echo Designs Your Way Out of a Paper Bag. So there's a story of this utility company in the Pacific Northwest. And this is like back in the 90s. They had all this problem with like snow and ice getting on the utility lines. And they would have to send guys out there to like clean it off sometimes, which is obviously dangerous and expensive. And so they hired some consultants to come in, like innovation consultants. And they were stuck, they did the usual brainstorm stuff, whatever. They broke for lunch, and one of the consultants happened to be sitting next to these two guys who actually go out and do this snow and ice stuff. And the two guys were just talking about a story of how one time they were out there and they encountered a bear. And so they break from lunch, and the new idea is, why don't we train bears to lick the ice off of the power lines? And then so somebody, the whole yes and stuff that you learn with brainstorming and ideation, so somebody's like, oh, how do you get the bear to lick the snow and ice off? And so somebody said, well, honey, we'll put honey on the lines, the bears will climb up and lick it on. And so rolling with the punches, somebody else said, okay, well, how are you gonna get the honey on the power lines? And a third person says, a helicopter. And if you've already connected the dots in your head, it's because it's like obvious in hindsight, right? If you bring in the helicopter, the downdraft from the helicopter blades will just blow off the snow and ice, which is how they do it today. But they needed to go through the whole process of like bear, honey, to helicopter, which is why you need to play in your ideation sessions. Thank you so much. One more local example. This is a project I worked on, a team I worked on at Parsons, where I also teach. There's this program called VITA, which stands for the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. It's an official IRS program. And as you can see, like it's all over the place from a branding angle because it's an official government program, but a lot of the services are provided by local municipalities and nonprofits that kind of go rogue with the branding. So, next slide, please. So we held a workshop, and the rest of the team, which I wasn't part of yet, did a workshop, and we had all sorts of people come in. People who use VITA, people who do taxes for people, and somebody just like drew on a napkin on a worksheet this Vitasaurus Rex thing. And if anybody's worked with local government, like they weren't going to go for this dinosaur mascot, but the idea was there, right? You needed a more distinct brand identity. It was more pointing at a need through this play, through this engagement, and then that's the real thing. You might have seen that in the subway. That's for real. It's just called NYC Free Tax Prep now, so they just call it that, but it's still VITA in the back end. Everybody's happy, works. This is some stuff that we do in our own work. We played with pipe cleaners and supplies and other things, and the idea here, the point here is that you don't have to be a skilled designer, you don't have to be super technical. This was working with the High Line to reimagine neighborhoods. We've worked with folks from groups at West Point to reimagine the cadet experience. Fast forward a little bit. And it doesn't just have to be playful, so we've also done work in Rwanda with the Genocide Memorial there, and it's not playful in the sense of fun and games, but it's still this idea of like how do you work with Post-its, how do you map out a timeline, and it's thinking about play in the theatrical sense of what is it like to go through a museum experience, learn about the history of this genocide, and how do you think about it in more like theatrical staging terms to create a compelling experience for visitors. All right, or sum up of this, and then the last point real quick. Design is a dialogue, and you want to set the stage for people to get hands-on, often in lo-fi ways, and you want to get lost in it. So final point, and then we'll wrap up, is that we also are futuring as designers, right? So I use future here as both a noun and a verb. There's a quote. All right, so this is a quote from Eliel Saarinen, who is the father of Eero Saarinen, the guy who designed the TWA, formerly Terminal, now Hotel, and the big arch in St. Louis. And basically it says that you want to design for the next larger context, right? So thinking about the chair, if you're designing the chair, you have to think about the table and chair relative to the room, to the house, to the street, etc. And so we also want to think about time context as well as like physical context. So final slide. This was another example from the Design for Financial Empowerment project that I mentioned. This one had to do with redesigning financial counseling services for New Yorkers. And so rather than just showing every new design idea, like a new brand identity or a new sign-up app, a new thing, like as individual things, we actually created a video that was like the future of financial counseling, showed every touch point in context, and that was a way to engage with our clients, thinking about that as future making. So, to wrap up, design is future making. We're telling these possibility stories all the time, whether you're pitching something or you're presenting your concepts, and this is all about shifting behaviors and power. So when you're imagining that larger context, how do you reimagine how people are going to behave? So those are some 4 points that hopefully you can take and apply to your own practice on how you engage and create participation across multidisciplinary teams. Thank you very much.
Any questions for LeeSean?
Thank you for presenting and giving this information in regards to product design. One of the things that I know that comes into play when you design a space is that people don't use it the way that you sometimes expect for. So, like, does that at all come into play with any of the design processes that you come across / build out, where you sort of design with, I guess you can't really fully design for how people might misuse your design, but sort of just asking that question as a generality.
I think some of it has to do with just the testing stage and the iteration stage, but the other has to do with the diversity of people you bring in for both the ideation or concepting stage early on, because maybe if you have a design team where everyone kind of thinks in a certain way, you wouldn't have thought of something, but if you have people from different perspectives, maybe like they could help anticipate those, but you're right, you can't always anticipate all of these unexpected uses of things. Question?
I was going to ask, how do we incorporate play into an increasingly remote world? But as I think about it, maybe the answer is the last option. The metaverse.
Maybe it's the metaverse, yeah.
So at one point you mentioned kind of trying to design as far as like when you're addressing like old systems that have been implemented for a while. You mentioned New Jersey's. I've been affected by that personally. Like they're so backlogged because they didn't expect there to be such a high amount of people reaching out to them for simple things. And I was wondering like in a situation like that, like is that like a situation from your in your opinion to where they have to like completely like revamp the whole system that they have been relying on, or do they take it bit by bit to update to what needs today?
I think sometimes.
Sorry to answer, because you're not.
Yeah, I didn't work on that problem exactly, but I have a similar story when I worked at the UN as a consultant, where sometimes they build like shiny new things to solve like things that are just fundamentally outdated or kind of obscure. So there's this thing, I don't know if anybody knows the weird world of diplomacy, but they have these things called diplomatic cables, which is basically just an encrypted fax. And so when I worked at the UN, somebody like would draft something in Microsoft Word, they would do the approvals and sign off, and then they would print it out, somebody important would sign it, and then they would send like a low-level person downstairs at UN headquarters, and like there was a room where like somebody would send a fax to like a UN office somewhere else or to an embassy somewhere else. I didn't work on this directly, but I learned about this at a meeting, but basically they were like digitizing things, but they couldn't change the fax part, so the digitization meant that like at the origin they still drafted it in Word, they printed it out, faxed it, but on the other end now, they have the option of somebody taking the fax, rescanning it, and then emailing it to people as a PDF. And so, like, there's all of these sort of workarounds that we do, like, around things, right? The other thing is, if anything's really that secret that needs encrypted, they put somebody directly in to deliver the message, right? So, like, we often create these really absurd workarounds around things. Sometimes it gets to the point where it, like, collapses and you have to build a new system. Other times, like, you have, like, the old and the new and, like, some very weird combinations. Yeah.
I work with a lot of people who see the workshops and say, yeah, that's cool, but how does it make you money?
Mm-hmm.
How do you pitch the ROI?
Well, it makes me money. No. Yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with like the process, right? I mean, like the bear and honey story is kind of absurd, but the idea here, with my technical difficulties, I missed this slide, but there was a case study that we had in our real work with a pharmaceutical company where they were building an intranet, and they were like, you know, tens of thousands of dollars over budget. They were like delayed by months, and we came in, had people who were like actually in tech and in sales in different places in the same room with like post-its and like cutouts, and they like reset the project in an afternoon, right? So sometimes there's all of these sort of things that just become like phone tag or email tag and like Zoom meetings where like you can solve it very easily with some post-it notes in person. So that's just one example of like sometimes you just have to be there, or like the lo-fi aspect of it actually resets things so that people who are like downstream from each other in the process can actually like engage with the system together.
Yeah.
So you mentioned in workshops working with a lot of people who are non-designers, and I was curious in those scenarios, how do you get some of those people who are not used to thinking out of the box and kind of pushing the boundaries of their imagination? How do you get them more used to the idea of play and start teasing out those kind of more interesting ideas that they may have?
Yeah, that's why like we sort of model behavior. Like that's why I make like tinfoil hats for myself and go to workshops without explaining anything. I've also been like, I used to hang out with theater kids. I guess I still hang out with theater kids. One of the things we borrow are like things from improv, you know, so we'll do warm-ups, so even if it's not directly related to the problem that we're trying to solve, we'll do like a small making activity or a small improv activity just to like warm people up and get them into the space.
What's your process for sort of future-proofing your own business development, but also seeing like there's white space in this industry to be disrupted, or like this is a place where there needs to be more innovation? How do you stay ahead of yourself?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Well, part of this stuff is thinking about how this stuff like scales, and I don't think some of it needs to scale. Like it's by nature very hands-on, very high touch. We'll see what actually happens as like COVID plays out in new ways. We tried some pivoting to like Zoom in the early days, and we did a few projects and it wasn't as compelling, but part of it was like learning how to use Miro boards and all of that sort of stuff. I think though ultimately it's about like how do we do this in hybrid ways? So even if there's like some people in the room and some people on Zoom, which is like inevitable now, like still having a compelling experience for people. But then the other stuff is like thinking about how to like bundle courses or do things that are more scalable as well. So I think it's multi-pronged. Any other questions or more stuff? More drinking and networking? Oh, in the back.
Yeah, I was thinking about the what you had, some of those examples you were showing in the workshops where it's like thinking about like the service design of a company, and I'm thinking about how sometimes in those scenarios you're kind of inheriting some fraud problem, like other organizational problems. Like I think the tax example was a good one where it's fragmented. You probably have like sometimes you have like different stakeholders and you don't know who's making decisions on the client side. How do you scope your projects in a way that you like doesn't lead into you kind of becoming like a change manager of them over the long term? Do you just like know exactly where your work begins and ends, and you have clarity on both sides?
We try to like stage things in ways so it's like maybe there's like we try to like convert as soon as possible, right? So it's like just like a relatively small workshop that's meant to be like both diagnostic for us, but also maybe like is a way of like moving the needle on a problem. But like from my branding days, for example, like any sort of like rebrand project or like redesigning the website project is basically just like opening up Pandora's box of all of the like sort of like dysfunctions in an organization, right? And power dynamics, or like I'm not against the UN, but there's so many UN stories. Another one during this internet project was that I tried to do a design, like a co-design thing to get feedback from the different diplomats I was working with, and like it was at a time when they were doing these like green initiatives, so they took away people's paper towels in the bathroom, and there were only the hand dryers. And so like I posted a question like, oh, how do you like share knowledge with your teammates, which was like what I was designing for, and it turned into this like complaint session about how there were no paper towels, which is like way above my pay grade. But basically, it's like if they didn't feel empowered to like wipe their hands the way that they wanted to, how were they gonna like volunteer to try out this pilot of the new internet, right? So like I didn't really have agency there, but it is sort of like, well, they said it and I'm here, and hopefully somebody who does actually like can do something about it, heard it in a way. So sometimes you inevitably have to deal with this sort of like organizational therapist kind of way, but that's like not what I was hired to do explicitly.